Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So we're going to talk a little bit about survey research. That's the topic in this particular video. And then in the next video, I'm going to talk about sampling. Um, in terms of the slideshow, it's from the same slideshow, but I want to separate them to use the sampling part of the lecture differently. So I'm going to share my screen. And so let's talk about the goals of the lesson. So uh, one is we're going to discuss reasons why people conduct survey research. What are some of the reasons for doing it? Two, we're going to identify factors to consider when writing questions for interviews or questionnaires. We're also going to think about our research objectives and the question wording and how they play a role. We're going to describe different ways to construct questionnaire responses, whether they be open-ended, closed-ended, rating scales, and so forth. Then we're going to compare how to administer surveys, whether it be in the written form or the oral form. We'll talk a little bit about interviewer bias, what a panel study does, and then, as I said, I'm not gonna include it in this video, but I'm gonna make a separate video that talks about the differences between probability and non-probability sampling, um, and then these three subtypes of each and various biases. All right, so let's begin. So the first question you might ask is, well, why do studies in the first place, or why do surveys in the first place? Well, there are a lot of answers to this question, but first is that collecting data is the way we draw meaningful conclusions. And as I mentioned in the first video I made, intuition and anecdotes are fine, but many times that source of data is non-scientific, right? So it can be a source of an idea, as I mentioned in a previous lecture as well. But in terms of getting meaningful information for science, we require data. And surveys allow us to get a lot of data in a relatively easy or efficient way. And I'm going to talk about that too. But this data that we need also uh, helps for us to see where we were at a given time and how things change over time, right? So it's also helpful to determine changes in society that we might need. And without data that we can get fairly easily from surveys, we would have to rely on, stories we've heard or letters that come in to give us a profile of what's going on in a time period or trying to understand people's attitudes. And uh, that's fraught, right? There are problems with that approach. So surveys will allow us also to have enough information to make public policy decisions. As I mentioned in lecture one of the sources of research is legislation and policy making, right? So, but surveys allow legislators to get a picture of what people want. So surveys also give us, what people are thinking at a given time. And we can get great information about attitudes and how they either stay the same or change through time. And of course, survey research is not the only form of research, right? So many times survey questions are used to augment or complement experimental research, right? So the most basic survey that goes with an experimental design is a demographics questionnaire that people give. So, but the nice thing is that survey research can be used in addition to experimental research. And the more research approaches or modalities you use, the more precise of a picture you get or an accurate depiction you get. So when you have survey data, though, you definitely want to make sure that you're getting truthful responses or accurate responses. However, there is the potential for people to engage in what's referred to as response sets. A response set is when a person responds to all questions from a particular perspective rather than what's truthful or accurate. So a common response set is something called social desirability. We all want to be liked. You want to be liked. I want to be liked. Everybody wants to be liked. Everybody wants to be approved of. So social desirability is a tendency to respond to questions in that which is considered socially acceptable or in a way that you anticipate society would approve of. So when we ask sensitive topics, like related to intimate partner violence or substance abuse or sexual practices or religious practices, any one of these questions, you have the potential for people to misrepresent their experience because there is either a stigma attached to it or there is some form of judgment from the larger culture. So people will answer in that which society approves of or that which is considered acceptable. And that's sometimes referred to as faking good. So if you're familiar with the MMPI, they have a measure to determine whether you're over accentuating the positive rather than being truthful. Now, let me give you an example as it relates to sexual practices and social desirability. In the United States, the view about sex differs whether we're talking about male sexual practices or female sexual practices. So let's take a simple question, such as how many sexual partners you had, right? So that might be on a clinical intake if you're doing therapy. You might ask about number of sexual partners because it gives you insight as to how a person forms and maintains relationships. So you might ask the number of sexual partners. All right. But what we have found is that males and females both misrepresent their answer. So for males, we tend to see a pattern of overrepresentation or exaggerating the number of sexual partners to a larger number than is actually true on average. Females, on the other hand, tend to report fewer number of sexual partners than is actually true. Now, this pattern does not explain everybody. And as society shifts, the answers will become more truthful, right? But for the current time period, I want you to think of terms that are used to describe males who are highly sexually active. historically, terms like stud, stallion, G, Mac, and so forth have been used largely as badges of honor for number of sexual partners. So their society encourages males to be prolific in sexual activities. Whereas for females, the terms are quite different. You might hear, and forgive me for using words that might be somewhat sensitive in nature, the term whore or slut or skank, or a more recent word, thought, right? These terms are not very complimentary. And because the terms that are used to describe females who are highly sexual are negative, that puts a societal pressure to underreport. So whereas males, the terminology in the larger attitudes in society, the terminology is a badge of honor. For females, in general, the terminology serves as a scarlet letter. So I want you to think about that. And that's why males, in order to appear in line with social standards, are going to over-report on average, whereas females are going to under-report. So that's something to think about, and we could go through all of them, right? So social desirability is an issue. You know, in my dissertation, I asked questions among Orthodox population about their level of religious belief and practice. And there is a societal pressure to adhere to faith in a complete way. So there's a concern that, you know, maybe Orthodox participants would over-report their practices. And then we also have connected with that in my dissertation. I asked about religious belief and practice and how it connects with substance abuse, which is also a taboo in the Jewish community. So knowing that I was tapping into two taboos, in my dissertation, I had to have a social desirability scale to check and make sure that people were answering truthfully. More about that in another video or for another day. But social desirability is important, right? So you may have watched the show House or House MD, and Gregory House has a phrase, everybody lies. So we know that people, when they're triggered by the taboos or stigmas, they're going to change their answers to a more socially acceptable way. So you have to be mindful of that. So how can you address social desirability? Now, in my study, I measured social desirability. I didn't eliminate social desirability. That's important to say. But you could increase honesty in a respondent by explaining to them the purpose of the research and just saying, hey, this research is going to help shed light on this a very important issue. And, the data is not going to be saying, oh, you said this answer. It's going to be large scale data. We also provide feedback. We say, if you want information, we can provide you feedback on this particular issue. And then confidentiality. People are more likely to be honest if they know that their answers are protected. So we talked about confidentiality in a previous video on research ethics, and it's very important to protect the answers that people say, because that is one of the commitments of a researcher, and our ethical code requires it. So, letting people know that their answers are going to be confidential is good. And if you can, I encourage you to go a little bit further and do anonymous surveys where their name is not even connected to their answers. And so if the data is anonymous and there's no way to identify who said what, you're also going to increase honesty. Okay. So when you're constructing the questions that you want to ask, you want to think about what your research objectives are. So, what are you trying to accomplish with this study? What do you want to know? Because the survey questions that you create or you use must be related to the research questions that are being addressed. So, that's very, very important. Now, there are three types of questions that we typically consider. So some questionnaires focus on attitude and belief, which is how you think. Other questions focus on facts and demographics. And I mentioned that even in many experimental designs, you will have a questionnaire that is a demographics questionnaire, and it'll include things like gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, marital status, employment, children. And this will allow you to compare group differences, right? So if you wanted to know if there are gender differences on a particular outcome, if you don't have a question in your demographics questionnaire about gender, you can't do that analysis. Or ethnicity, if you're curious about ethnic differences, that has to be on your demographics questionnaire. Now, let's say you weren't interested in your research about gender, ethnicity, or marital status, or any of these things. So you might say to yourself, well, I don't need a demographics questionnaire, do I? And the answer to that question is you still need one. Why do you need one? Because in the methods section, you are going to have to describe a profile of your participants. And asking questions about age, gender, ethnicity, marital status, and so forth allows you to write a comprehensive picture of your participants. And the more demographics questions you have, the reader is going to have a much better picture of your sample. So facts and demographics are used. They're used as part of questionnaires. And by the way, you can have a survey battery that includes all three of these types. And then the last of the three, so we talked about attitudes and beliefs and facts and demographics. The last type of questions are on behavior. So this is what you're doing, not how you think, but what you're doing. And questions could be about past behavior or present behavior. Questions like, how many times did you exercise for 20 minutes or longer in the last week? Right? So that's a behavioral activity, and you can, ask about it. And this also highlights past behavior. All right. The next thing you want to consider is how you construct your questions. And there are many factors that will creep in to your questionnaire that could create bias. So the first thing I want you to think about is the question wording. So if you use jargon, imprecise terms, if you have grammatical errors or problems in sentence structure, that could result in error in your data. And I'm going to share with you a study I did where I realized that the way the question was phrased was problematic. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But we also have issues where you might have a survey question that goes on and on and on, and it taxes your memory. You could create error or noise in the data that way. Or having misleading information or misleading questions could result in problems. So you definitely want to think about your question you're asking. So here are some of the common problems people have when they write their questions. And this is a list, so I'm going to go through each of them. So I'm not going to read off of here, but let's go through each of these issues. So one thing that you have to be concerned with is simplicity, right? Your words, your survey wording should be very simple. It should be very easily understood. For example, the MMPI, which is a measure of personality, is written at roughly a 4th grade reading level. And it was done by design so that education doesn't become a factor in how people perform on the test. And if you were to think about what is the sweet spot for questions, I would say anywhere between a 5th to 8th grade reading level. You don't have to go all the way to a 4th grade reading level. If you did that, that's wonderful. But you can assume the average respondent has roughly a 5th to 8th grade reading level. And the more sophisticated the questions, the more you isolate or alienate certain segments of the population, and that questionnaire can't be used for them. So avoid technical terms and jargon. So if I were to ask you the following question, I want you to know or think about whether you know what this question is saying. In your recent myocardial infarction, did you have hypertension? So that question, for some of you, again, I'll restate the question. In your recent myocardial infarction, did you have hypertension? That question is a risky question because it's not speaking in the layperson's language. So let me ask the same question and see if you struggle with it now. In your recent heart attack, did you have high blood pressure? It's the same question without the technical terms and jargon. Now you see, some of you might have understood the question the first time around, but I've used that example many times, and what I have found is that even the average college student struggles with that question, the first question, unless they're in the biology field, and then they get it. But so avoid jargon, and if you need to use jargon, define your terms, right? It's okay to italicize a term and explain it. I'm currently mentoring a student for a thesis on microaggressions. And one of the things I said was, if you have questions on microaggressions, it's very, very important that you explain what a microaggression is, because you can't assume that people who participated in your study know what a microaggression is. So, all right, so that's a good example. So we also have double-barreled questions. A double-barreled question is when you ask 2 questions at the same time. And if you want to remember this as a way of thinking about it, think of a double-barreled shotgun. It shoots 2 rounds simultaneously, right? So double barrel questions, really, you're supposed to be asking one question, but it challenges the person. And you could get errors in responses, because what if the answer to one question is on one side of the spectrum, and then the second question that's combined, it's the other side. You may struggle with how to answer. And I'm going to take a very exaggerated version, but watch this. True or false? I like ice cream and killing puppies. Now, if you had to answer that question, hopefully, for most of you, you're being pulled in opposite directions. So if you like both, that's concerning. But what if you like ice cream, but you don't like harming animals, right? So then you're going to be stuck with, do I answer true or do I answer false? And most people are going to pick the part of the question that resonates most with them. So that creates noise. So wouldn't it be better to separate those into two individual questions? True or false, I like ice cream. True. True or false, I like killing puppies. False, right? Now there's no error. So when you read a questionnaire or you write a questionnaire, be careful with asking too many questions simultaneously because it's going to create a problem. Loaded questions. Loaded questions are similar to in a law, if you've ever watched Law and Order, objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. So a loaded question is a question that is biased and emotionally charged to one side of the sample. So if it leads you to answer in a particular way because of some kind of emotional reaction, that's a loaded question. All right. Now, we also have to consider negative wording. When you use negative wording, it creates a cognitive conflict. You have to read the question, understand the question, and flip it to the right way. So most researchers encourage you to always write your question in the affirmative, always write in the positive. So notice I said, I like. I didn't use the word I dislike. I like ice cream, true or false. I like killing puppies, true or false, right? So it's written in the positive so that you don't have to think or undo it, because that negative phrasing can confuse people and it will result in inaccurate answers. Now, before I go into yay saying and nay saying, which is a response from the participants, I'd like to talk to you about an example from my own research where I had an item on my survey that lacked precision. So I was doing some research on whether or not psychologists should have the right to prescribe medication. And I did a study not asking psychologists, because there's a lot of past research that's psychologists support it. And more often than not, I should say, it's not 100% of the psychological community. And the medical community has historically opposed this. So I did a study and I was like, well, what about the other prescribing professionals? What about nurse practitioners and physician assistants? And in my first study, I did this study in New York. So I was only interested in the New York sample. And what I did was I provided the reader both sides of the debate. And again, I stated all my questions. I stated all my questions in the affirmative, so that wasn't the problem. So, but I had a total of 15 questions on this survey. There were, I think, 8 positive statements and 7 negative statements, or vice versa. Or it wasn't a negative statement, I should say. It was a concern that people had about psychologists prescribing. And in the debate, people argue both sides. So I took all the arguments and put it into a questionnaire. All right. I wrote an item that sounded like this. Psychologists being granted prescriptive privileges will increase malpractice rates. And you could answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And it was like every other question that it was on a Likert scale. And we're going to talk about how Likert scales work as we go. But I realized that that question had a lot of noise in the data, whereas there's a great deal of sensitivity between the groups on many of the items. This particular item was problematic. And it was because I used imprecise terms. Now, when we use the term malpractice rates, that could be interpreted as adverse experiences among your clientele. So cases of malpractice, right? Which is how I meant it, because people say, oh, well, if psychologists have the right to prescribe medication, there's going to be more incidents of improper prescribing and malpractice. All right. But the question also could have been interpreted as malpractice rates as in insurance premiums. So insurance premiums could be raised due to having an additional license. And the answer was that some people interpret it as incidences of malpractice and some people interpret it as insurance premiums. And that's why that item didn't yield any meaningful differences. So that is a good example. I was still able to publish the study because that was one item on a scale, and we used factor analysis to make sure the scale was good. But the mean scores, I looked at the mean scores, and there were still significant differences between nurse practitioners and physician assistants. In general, what we found was that nurse practitioners were far more favorable than physician assistants, even though the means for both NPs and PAs were loaded towards the positive. So both had some level of support, but there were significant differences between the two groups. Interesting, right? You take that study and that word or that item can be flawed. So really you want to think about your wording. Now, you can use, I'm going to skip yay saying and nay saying one more time and talk about software programs. There is something called the Question Understanding Aid, which is a software program that is designed to analyze questions for some of these problems. And then in terms of reading level, you don't even need anything that's sophisticated. Microsoft Word will tell you the reading level of your survey. There's something called a Flesch-Kincaid scale, which tells you readability. So you could definitely check some of these problems. All right. Now, you know how I said that social desirability was a problem in responding? We also have an issue with yay saying and nay saying, which are how you might answer the question. So yay saying is just to agree, yes, 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 or true, 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 strongly agree, strongly agree, strongly agree, all the way down the questionnaire. Now, I'm sure you've had to fill out surveys before and didn't read them and you just clicked. We've all done that. But if you answered all the way down across the board, yes, that's called yay saying. Nay saying is the opposite, right? So that's where you say no, 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 all the way down, right? So this is a problem. You have to be careful with yay saying and nay saying in surveys. So the question is, how do you deal with that? You can use reverse coding, right? Reverse coding is a procedure where you phrase the questions in one direction and then have a question that is the exact opposite. And if the person is yay saying, it will reveal itself, right? Because the person should answer the opposite. For example, let's say you had a statement on a questionnaire about early childhood relationships, and a question said, "I love my mom." So if you said true to that, if later in the questionnaire it said, "I hate my mom," what should you say? You should say false, right? But if you say true all the way down, well, then you're contradicting yourself, right? And I'm able to detect that you are yay saying by phrasing the question a second time in the opposite direction. Now, when you score these questions, reverse coding is that level of love for one's mom. And the second one would be if you disagreed, right? You said false to "I hate my mom." That would indicate positive emotion, assuming that it's binary. I think love is on a spectrum if you want to know the truth. So that's just a silly example. So one way to identify yay saying and nay saying is to phrase questions in the opposite direction. You have to make sure you score them through reverse coding, right? Another way to determine yay saying and nay saying is what we call validity checks. A validity check is where you throw in an item that isn't part of the survey, but it just tests whether people are answering without reading or not. So you might say, for this item, pick false. If they're reading, they're going to pick false. And you have a bunch of them like sprinkled in through the survey, then you know if people are just going down. And if they trip off or fail sufficient number of validity checks, then you have the right to exclude their data. So that's one way of doing it. All right. Now, let's apply what we've learned. So professors should not be required to take daily attendance. Well, that is negative wording. The emphasis is on not, right? So do you study or spend time with your friends in the afternoon? Well, is it possible that you do both? Right? So that's a double-barreled question, right? So when you think about it, spending time with your friends, you could actually do both, right? So you might want to separate that into two questions, such as, do you study in the afternoon? Do you spend time with your friends in the afternoon? To allow for it to be both. Do you still speed on the freeways, right? So this one's a little bit tricky. The implication is that you're still doing it. So have you done it, and are you still doing it? So one might argue that this is a double-barrel question, right? Now, other people might say, well, this is a loaded question because it's, has the word still, could also be judgment. So on our, on questions or tests, I try and make sure that it's clear cut. This one could potentially have two problems with it. Would you like to be beautiful and a scholar? Again, double-barreled. Do you believe the relationship between cell phone behavior and consumption of fast food is orthogonal? What's the word orthogonal mean? Right? So that's simplicity, because that's jargon. It wouldn't be correct to follow that procedure, would it? Wouldn't. You see the contraction and apostrophe T, so that's negative. And then, are you in favor of the boss's whim to cut lunchtime to 30 minutes? Whim is emotionally leading, so that's a loaded question, right? So it's important to look at how the questions are written, because any one of these questions could come on a survey and it would be problematic. Now, once you've written the questions, once you've evaluated the questions, then you have to decide what the response options are going to be to the questions. So you could choose to have close-ended questions. You could choose to have open-ended questions. When we talk about close-ended questions, you're giving the reader or the respondent only a select few options. You're listing out the option choices, and that's all they can answer. Now, there are benefits to this, of course. It allows for greater structure, easier coding. Everybody gets the same survey because of that, or the responses are predictable. And it's good, it's used well when you're dealing with a topic that people are familiar with or well defined. Now, you can analyze the data easier. You get a lot of breadth because you can sprinkle on a whole bunch of information. The problem is that you don't get as much depth, and for lesser defined concepts, that's not going to give you enough richness of information. So an open-ended question is a question where a person can answer any way they want, right? So this can give you valuable insights unique to the individual, what they were thinking. When it comes down to it, this is better when you have less known variables, right? It's harder to code and categorize. There's some challenges there, and it's more expensive to do this, but it's richer. It gives you depth. So the choice is depth versus breadth. Now, I know what you're thinking. Is it possible to have a survey that has both? The answer is yes. And oftentimes that does occur. People do have surveys with both. So, in fact, many times students at the end of a semester, they fill out faculty evaluations. And then some of the questions are strongly agree to strongly disagree. So those would be examples of close-ended questions. But then at the end, it's my instructor's greatest strength was, and you could fill in the blank, right? So filling in the blank is open-ended. All right. So when we talk about close-ended questions, you have to decide the number of response alternatives, right? So you have a fixed number of choices. For that battery, it should be relatively the same. It should stay pretty stable, right? So if you want, you can do dichotomies, yes, no, true, false, agree, disagree. But if you want to have greater sensitivity as it relates to that question, it's much better to have a scale, whether it be a 5-point scale or a 7-point scale on a spectrum, right? That allows for a more diverse set of responding, and that's much more useful, right? It gives them greater ability to express themselves. Now, rating scales, again, they typically are how much judgments, right, of a given factor. The format depends on the topic. You'll notice that they're typically 5 or 7-point scales, as we just saw, right? So when you have an odd number, the middle point would be neutral, right? So if you had strongly agree to strongly disagree, the middle point would be neither agree nor disagree, right? In the previous rating scale, you'll notice that only the endpoints were labeled, right? Now, what happens if you don't want people to sit on the fence? You don't want people to hedge their bet. So you can use a 4-point or 6-point rating scale where neutral is not a choice. So that might force people to pick a side. But think about that, right? There are strategies for both. Now, there are other ways to visually depict your answers or response choices. So you can have what's called a graphic rating scale, which is just a line that's 100 millimeters long, and you have on the endpoints labeled, and you can have 0 to 100, and wherever they put the X on that line, if they put it on the end, it's 0, right? If they put it on the other end, it's 100. And wherever they put it in the middle, it will be whatever that number is, whatever millimeter it's at. So you can get scores from 0 to 100 because of that. Now, this particular approach, you would have to get a ruler and measure it, right? We also have graphic rating scales with sliders on the computer. They've made it a lot easier to do this kind of research. All right. Now, semantic differential scales, this is where we are comparing people on bipolar opposites of dimensions. So these dimensions must be dichotomous, right? So they're dichotomous. Pardon me, they have to have dichotomous poles, but they can be spectrum-based. Forgive me for that. So evaluation, activity, and potency are very common dimensions or basic dimensions for semantic differential. So here I am. I get no royalties, but my prop, Starbucks coffee. You could evaluate Starbucks coffee using these 3 basic dimensions. I would ask you to rate Starbucks coffee based on whether you think it's good or bad, right? And you could put anywhere on that dimension. Right now, if you're a Starbucks person like me, you're going to be loaded towards the good side. If you're a Dunkin' person or a 7-Eleven person or any other coffee person, you might rate it as bad. Activity. So there's different levels of caffeine, right, in this. And based on how you ingest it could be fast acting or slow, right? So you could rate how long it took for the drug to take effect. And then potency is strength, right? Starbucks actually is one of the strongest coffees on the market. So you could rate your coffee in relative to potency. So these are just 3 dimensions and something silly like coffee. Now, what happens when you have individuals who may not have the vocabulary or understanding of complex emotions, let's say? You can allow people to rate things using pictures. So these emojis on the bottom. Now, this is routinely done in a hospital for pain. Like they show you pictures, what's your pain scale. It's also done when you have people who are not native English speakers, right? So it could also help with that. So nonverbal scales are also used. So I think we can see this is a 3-point rating scale: happy, neutral, sad, right? But it could be any number of those. Now, up to this point, I've talked to you about labeling the endpoints, but there might be a reason to label all of your response options. So if the options are not weighted equally, then you have to label each of the response options so that it allows a person to give a more accurate picture. And you might have had this experience when applying to college, and you will have this experience again if you did when you apply to graduate school. When you ask your professors to write letters of recommendation, many universities also have an accompanying rating scale, and they give you different virtues or personality characteristics, and they ask you to rate it. But you'll notice at the top, all of the choices are labeled. And you might say, well, why are they labeled? Because listen to this. You might have a response that says bottom 50th percentile as the first choice, 50th to 75th percentile, 75th to 85th percentile, 85th to 90th percentile, 90 to 95, 95 to 99, above 99. Notice that the values of the responses in terms of percentile, the range of options shift across the survey. So if the distance between one choice is different than another choice, it helps better discriminate between the choices. So really what you're looking at here is a weighted response option. So in those cases, you certainly want to label your choices, all of your choices. Now, labeling the endpoints is good. I always recommend labeling all your choices if you can anyway, even if you don't need to, even if it's equally weighted. But if they're not equally weighted, you must label all your response choices. All right. And then it allows you to get rid of vague answers, such as if a person was working out, how often do you work out? Well, if you're in a fitness program, you would have a high frequency scale where the lowest response might be less than 2 days a week, and the highest response would be daily. But if you're surveying the average person, not in some fitness program, you might have a low frequency scale for working out, which starts with less than 1 time a month to more than 1 time per week, where if you're not into fitness, working out more than 1 time a week is already good. So, all right. So now we've considered what we're trying to study, the factors, whether it's attitudes, demographics, or behaviors. We've evaluated the wording of our questionnaire, and we've decided on the response options. Now we have to format the questionnaire. So we're getting to the final end, right? So here are some general principles when you format your survey. So the first is that your survey should appear attractive and professional. So group themes together. Don't have it all over the place, right? That's one thing. You should make sure that your survey has no typos. It's strongly recommended that you have people read your survey to make sure that it doesn't have typos. Space things out nicely so it's visually appealing. I've seen surveys where they try and cram too much on a page, and people aren't going to want to do your survey that way. So leave space between questions and responses. Use your point scale consistently. Don't go from strongly agree to strongly disagree on a 5-point scale and then switch to true, false in between. Whatever your scale is for that section, it should be consistent. All right. And here's a general principle for just data collection. Always put the most interesting and most important questions first. Why? The most interesting question should go first because it's going to capture their attention. The most important question should go first because that allows you to do an analysis on something if they quit the study. So you motivate them to finish the survey, but if they don't finish the survey, you already captured the data you need in the beginning. All right. Now you want to refine the question, so have other people proofread it. You might consider a small group, a focus group, to think about this, and you read the question, you ask them how they understood the question, they talk it out, and if they interpreted the question differently than you meant it, then you have to modify the question. Had I done that with this item, I would have avoided a problem with the malpractice rate question. So questionnaires in general, what are the pros? Well, in a written format allows them to indicate their responses on the form. It's cheaper than doing interviews. It also allows for anonymity, right? So people, if it's a written survey, they don't have to put their name on it. Now, the problems with survey or downside is that if it's in a written format, people must be able to read. And if you give people surveys that they're going to mail back to you, let's say, and I haven't talked about how to administer them, but assuming that these are being mailed out and mailed back, people might find the questions boring and stop. So you run the risk of having a reduced response rate. Now, in terms of personal administration, you could personally administer the questions to groups or individuals. So now they're in the same room as you. Now you have a captive audience, literal and metaphorical. So they're more likely to complete the survey. So because of that, you're going to have a greater response rate. You also have the benefit of people being able to ask you questions. What did you mean by that? Right. So that's the benefit. Now, when you mail out surveys, it's fairly cheap, but you have a low response rate. Why? As I said earlier, people start and stop, or they put it aside and they forget about it, or they throw it out because it's in the mail. And if you have questions related to the material, you can't ask questions, right? So that's questionnaires. You have internet surveys. Internet surveys is another way to collect data, and there's Mechanical Turk, which I think is connected with Amazon, right? That people can earn money if they fill out Mechanical Turk surveys. Not a lot, but it's through the internet, right? So the benefit of internet-based surveys are they're pretty easy to design. The data immediately goes to the researcher, and you can target a particular population if you want. The problem, or some of the problems I want you to think about, is whether people who fill out internet surveys are similar to people who don't fill out internet surveys. And you might say, well, what do you mean? You could potentially have an effect of classism. People who can afford the internet are potentially different than people who can't afford the internet. And then how you sample respondents is going to be challenging because people over the internet can portray themselves any way they want. So they can misrepresent their age, gender, ethnicity, or people can select the survey because of a particular bias. So all of these are concerns. So now let's get to interviews. Interviews are more costly than survey questionnaires. You're more likely to participate in an interview if people are there right in front of you. Now, good interviewers have the opportunity to get you to participate because you're being interviewed. There is fewer number of blank responses because they could do follow-up questions or say, hey, let's circle back to that question you skipped. All of these are good. But the problem with interviews is you could potentially have an interviewer bias, right? When you interview a person, you have to be careful, A, how you ask the question, and B, the kind of responses you give to a person's answers could cause an interviewer bias. So if I ask you a question and I nod in approval, you're more likely to continue. But if I give you a dirty look, you're less likely to answer that way. So an interviewer bias could occur by giving certain or tipping your hand up what you think is socially appropriate or not. You could also have the problem with how you phrase the question, or you could lead them to answer in a certain way. So these are interviewer bias you have to be careful with, and careful training and screening could reduce this risk. Now, interviews can be done face-to-face. They can be done telephonically. They can be done through focus groups. Face-to-face interviews are the most costly. So when we see face-to-face interviews, they tend to be smaller sample sizes. Typically, that requires the interviewer and respondent to meet. An interview is going to travel to the respondent pre-COVID world, right? And that's time and money. Telephone interviews are quicker because you cut out the travel time. They tend to be more large scale. They tend to be cheaper. Now, but they're still done face-to-face and telephone interviews so far. We're still talking about on an individual level. But you can also have a focus group, which is anywhere between 6 to 10 individuals, which meets for several hours, which is also time consuming. But the questions tend to be open-ended and you get depth. It tends to be recorded and transcribed. But now, when you're done with that 2 or 3 hours, instead of having one interview, you have anywhere between 6 to 10 interviews. Now, we also need to understand that when we ask people their behaviors or we ask people their attitudes and behavior change over time, right? So a panel study can determine whether there were changes across time. Now, a panel study, you're giving the same survey at 2 or more points in time. A standard survey, you just give it once, right? But a panel study, it's strategic that you want to give it two or more times. So a 2-wave panel study would be surveyed at 2 points in time. A 3-wave panel survey, again, people would be surveyed at 3 points in time. So however many waves there are, that's the number of points in time they're surveyed. And you can track from point A to point B or point A to point B to point C and determine stability versus change in attitudes. That's important. Now, I'm gonna stop here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to, yeah, I think I'm gonna stop here because I'm gonna do the sampling video separately. So let me end this recording and we'll talk about sampling separately.